But nonetheless, this graph takes the time to stop and hold position for this time, which is strangely in itself, it's impressive. And my friend had he subsequently a psychic download, and again or a psychic impression of their purpose and the significance of the event. But nonetheless, what you've been talking about in in reference to the beginning of your outline of this theory, drawn from observations of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is that the human being is fundamentally alienated from himself because his impression of himself is socially derived. But with the anomalous and the supernatural and the UFO subject, human beings accrete for themselves or experiences which are rigidly outside that social realm. As such, they're protected from the social degradation and the negativity and the entropy you find there. In short, they're defended from the violence of the social existence. This seems to go with social existence in all its forms. Now, I think from that you wanted to take it a bit further with Strieber and what have you. But if I can just add to that, in what you're outlining with Lacan and psychoanalysis, of which I know nothing, I have to say, I could see it seemed to me there were parallels with Gurdjieff's thoughts, in that there is this idea that they're fundamentally what passes for a human being is the multiplicity, is the legion of a whole host of eyes, which are all serving, which are fragmented, and which are all products of the various energies found within the human being, but do serve various social purposes as a result of those individual eyes identifying with certain experiences. Now, how in the Gurdjieff schema is you probably remember how the self is unifying or finds integration even in its account of itself. It comes from beneath the personality. There is an essence which is fundamentally undisturbed by social interaction, but is fundamentally undeveloped given the nature of our society. And something that, and the reason for that is that the essence does not receive impressions directly on itself, that all impressions are mediated through the filters of these various cells. Now, of course, I'm sure you, as I'm saying this, you're packaging this, and you can translate this probably into more refined concepts you find within Lacanian psychoanalysis and the like. But ultimately, the difference between the quality, the impressions falling on essence or falling on personality, is the quality and intensities of the impressions. And it seems to me is that there's something in analyzing the quality and the intensity of the impression of the supernatural and UFOs, where people receive an intensity of an impression, which by Gurdjieff's understanding is a food for the growth of essence. So in a roundabout way, I think there's a parallel there in sort of Gurdjieff's thinking, that these sightings and the experience of the supernatural are a spur to a growth of an essence which we overwhelmingly don't see.
Well, it's interesting what you say. I think that you're right, and I think that there are at least 2 points of agreement, in a sense, between this scenario that I'm presenting that involves this particular kind of psychoanalysis and Gurdjieff. Now, in order to put the finishing touches on the theory, what I need to do is go in reverse now, in a way that we've climbed the ladder up to a certain height. Now we have to go back down. And one thing I wanted to say at the outset, and this will tie in directly with everything you just said, And that is this particular theory, such as it is, to me, is an answer to the so-called trickster nonsense that you also hear about endlessly on the internet now. And it's another one of my pet peeves and irritations. You know, they have this meme image that they like to swap around of this guy who was on Ancient Aliens with the bad hair. And, you know, you've probably seen it 100 times as, I don't know, therefore aliens. Oh, that's so clever. That's supposed to be like a refutation of the ETH and all that kind of shit. Well, you could just as easily create a meme with some idiot there like George Hansen and say, I can't understand it, therefore trickster. In other words, if something is too complex to make sense of, therefore trickster. And to me, I say, why not just go the whole hog, which is really just an extra couple of inches, and say Satan? Why not say Satan? Because in effect, this silly notion of the trickster, which gains its authority from Jungian psychoanalysis, which to me is near useless, the idea of an archetype, which to me is near useless, is just watered down Platonism. But this idea of a trickster is just, it's secular superstition. It doesn't have any foundation in an existing set of religious beliefs, so therefore it's not socially threatening. But really, it's identical to a superstition in the way it operates. It's a superstitious theory. It's a secular superstitious theory, which, I mean, to me, it's utterly useless. So every time I hear somebody say trickster, I want to reach for my gun. But anyway, so this theory that we're discussing, again, such as it is, in a way, is an antidote to that. So here's how we go back down the ladder. Let's start off again with the idea of the political and the idea of the state. Now, an assertion I made a few minutes ago was that the state itself only appears with the emergence of agriculture. Let's suppose that that's the case and that what we think of as the state really is just a kind of consequence of agriculture. We nevertheless take it for granted that there has to be such a thing as a state. You know, because the opposite, which we conceive of as being anarchy, is something that we consider to mean total lawlessness, rampant criminality, the end of progress and technology and all these things. So we think of it as the complete destruction of everything, the removal of the state. But, you know, if you are a quote unquote extraterrestrial and you're watching human beings and you have the long view, this thing that we take for being granted and inevitable is just a sort of weird byproduct of agriculture, the ability to grow food with relative abundance in one location geographically. And if you look at the state today, this is something that's becoming very obvious to a lot of people. What is the state? The state is just like the Cosa Nostra, it's our thing. There's a small group of people. The boundaries aren't rigidly defined and they're permeable, so people go in and people go out, but basically it's one group of people sitting on top of a pile of food. And what could be more obvious than the fact that they try to transmit it generationally? You've got one Bush who becomes president, and then his son becomes president, or the Kennedy dynasties, or the fact that Chelsea Clinton will get a job with a major news network without any kind of journalism background, and the fact that all of these people in the media companies are married to the directors of corporations, and the incestuous nature of it all just belies the fact that you have the same group of people who struggle to get a place on top of the food pile, and then you got other people, which is us, looking at them on top of the food pile, wishing that they could have some. That's all a government is. That's all the state is. Look at kings and queens, for Christ's sake, and the fact that the wealth is concentrated in their hands and passed down generationally. I mean, what other kind of proof do you need? Now, we don't today think there's any basis in reality for monarchy. We don't any longer believe in the divine right of kings. Of course, there are kings that still exist, mainly as historical artifacts and out of a desire to maintain tradition and so on. But the state, as we experience it today, is really not any different than monarchy. You have a small group of people who use an overt system of symbolic rites and traditions and so on in order to secure wealth for themselves and their descendants. This is what the state had always been. Now, if you view it that way, and let's say that that's correct, let's say that that is really what we're talking about with the human state. And if you're some extraterrestrial to whom this is obvious, why would you land on the White House lawn? You know,
Right.
you might as well ask Jane Goodall why she doesn't sit down and parley with the alpha male among the gorillas. Why the fuck would she? And if you see the state itself purely in terms of this, like just as a pure consequence of a particular distortion introduced by agriculture, you're not going to think of it as having any intrinsic meaning. So that's the state. Now, similarly, going back down the ladder, if we look at human public discourse, everything that we can call culture, as being a kind of intersection between the political and the social. And we know that the political is about controlling resources directly and controlling other people in order to control those resources. If we look at culture, we see basically the same aspects. Just like I was trying to get at a bit ago about university life being basically war. You can look at every sphere of human life and basically see the same war of all against all. And in culture, it's the same thing. I mean, why would Isaac Newton try to destroy Leibniz, a professional rival? Well, these are two men of science, supposedly, right? Both of them are worshippers of reason, right? Well, in every domain, you see people trying to destroy each other in the cultural sphere. So why don't the extraterrestrials manifest themselves in ways that are culturally significant? Why don't they come down and talk to the intellectuals? Well, why would they? If what we regard as the cultural is really just war of all against all, there again, why would you? If what we take for granted as being so basic to human existence is obvious to them as being something trivial and other than it appears, then they wouldn't. Now take it down another step on the ladder. Now we get down to the ego and to self-consciousness. Here again, we take it to be self-evident that when I'm thinking of myself, I exist. I mean, this is Descartes, or at least a particular version of Descartes. And, I exist, and I have thoughts that are not known to other people, and feelings that are not known to other people. And these things have substance. They are real. Well, what if these other beings know and realize that this ego that we completely identify with and think is real and struggle to the death to defend is just one part of the brain communicating to another? And it's just a sort of appendix, speaking in anatomical terms, and that it's a way of self-presenting a socially mediated interpretation that has benefits for deep unconscious satisfaction, and it really doesn't have any basic connection to reality. Where it connects to reality or actuality is just by accident. In which case, our greatest intimacies, these thoughts and feelings that we have that we think are real on account of the fact that we can see them and others can't. You see there's a kind of convoluted or involuted logic there. When we convince ourselves that we are real, it's usually through a couple of very quick steps or maneuvers, and one of them is the reference to the social. These thoughts exist, and they don't exist for other people, therefore they are my thoughts, and I identify with them and call them me. This whole idea that we are real, that we have value, that we're individuals, and all this kind of shit could be to them just like a deficiency, just an expression of pure deficiency.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at this.
Before you interrupt, let me just finish the last part of it, because otherwise I might forget. There is a basis for this in accounts of contact, and specifically in accounts by Strieber. The most valuable contributions Strieber has made to the picture of contact that we have are generally overlooked. Now, if you go to Ed Conroy's book, he is at least smart enough in the beginning of the book to say, well, Strieber always had a fascination or a preoccupation with predation. In other words, if you look at all of his successful early horror novels, they're all about predators of some extent, of some form. And if you
Right.
look at the way he describes the so-called visitors in Communion, there's a heavy element of the predator. So he clearly associates the two together. Now, Kripal also sort of points this out, and he attaches to it his notion of the dangerous sacred, and he rightly connects Strieber's, there's a very small overlooked aspect of Strieber's work involving basically the erotic experience of death. And if you look at it, you can connect the two in as much as if you are in the presence of an absolute otherworldly predator, where the natural consequence is this experience of death in life, your total annihilation. From the vantage point of life, of course, death is experienced as this sort of orgasmic, destructive force. Anyway, there's more to it than that. And that's because, and the reason why it's not known is because people don't actually study Strieber's work. There's a story that he tells in, I think, a subscriber interview that I think he told only once. And the fact that he's only told it once tells you just how much his stories are dominated by his own interpretation. Now, I'm not trying to make the pedantic point that his interpretations are all wrong, but I'm saying he favors some stories over others, and the ones that he doesn't tell often, he might well be the most worthy ones. Anyway, he tells a story of the time around Communion when the book was published. And he is talking in the story about how, he basically venerated this woman on the cover of Communion and equated her with like Sumerian goddess, and at one point thought she was the creator of the world. But then he's walking down the street in New York at one point in some neighborhood, and he looks up and he sees her, what he regards as her, standing on the balcony, beckoning him in. So he goes up to this apartment, and he goes inside the apartment, and he finds basically squalor. He gets the immediate impression that there's this woman, and she's sharing it with a husband who's like a small gray. And the woman is naked. Once he's brought inside the apartment, he sees that she's naked, and what does she do but immediately squat down and urinate in front of him? Now, he didn't draw out the full implications of that, but he sort of almost got to them, in as much as he started by talking about how he had venerated her, and then he has this experience of her squatting down like an animal and pissing in front of him on the carpet. To me, the obvious interpretation was that here is this woman showing Strieber, in a sense, that she is not a goddess and showing her actual nature. And this blends very well with their quote-unquote sardonic sense of humor that's described often enough. But more than that, if you read the Conroy book, there's an interview that Strieber gives with Conroy where, I think it's toward the end of the book, he also says something that he hasn't really repeated elsewhere, and that is, in his opinion, the so-called visitors are conscious beings that, in his word, have not been enculturated. That is, they don't enter into culture. They are this sort of impossible union between beast and God.
Exquisite instinct.
There you go. Now, to me, this makes perfect sense when you regard the human ego as an object, not as a subject. In other words, we have insufficiently powerful consciousness. We don't think and feel strongly, vividly with each other all the time in the way that you might say beings do who are telepathic, just to use the term. We have a very dim sense of compassion and so on. So we're basically living in individualized solipsistic worlds. And as a compensation for that fact, we create a me, an ego, that is basically a repository of all of our, you know, preferred self-images, and I'm a good person because of this, and I did this one time, and here's my sense of humor, and here's my mode of personality. This is just a big repository with which we fully identify. But it's an artifact, it's an object. Now, from the point of view of these visitors, the ego may be just this absurd autistic aberration. So everything that we constantly praise, and you'll read this even in Strieber and other contact accounts, and it's always the same old chauvinism. It's said, well, I think, sure, they have this incredible genius and this collective mind, but, we are individuals. And because we're individuals, we have so much power. Well, do you really? Why aren't you out floating around the universe then? You're such a powerful individual. You're stuck on a fucking barbaric planet, fighting over resources. The individual is an absurdity. The idea is that becoming a collective is some sort of deprivation, but really that is itself a fantasy of the ego mind. The idea I will lose my preferred object. It doesn't have any bearing on the actual reality of what it is to exist inside a collective consciousness, as these beings may well do.
And this is basic Buddhism. It's just you're right into the guts of any spiritual teaching, any of the Indian spiritual teachings, which would say exactly that. I mean, your purpose is to transcend the ego, and then in terms of
Well, I apologize, but I wanted, before we move too far, I wanted to say this is what connects to Gurdjieff, right? When Gurdjieff says that not all human beings are conscious, it's an amazing thing to say because everyone takes it for granted that they're conscious. I'm awake, I'm conscious. But what if that's not consciousness at all? What if human beings are actually not conscious? Now, this is not coming at it from exactly the same point of view as saying, well, we have all of these different eyes, and on the basis of the fragmentary experience, we don't have anything permanent and therefore anything real. It's not quite the same thing. The idea is that if you take the ego as a recognizable object, and it's just one that we constantly cognitively identify with and, convince ourselves is real, we're not conscious. Maybe there's only consciousness in a collective consciousness. There is no such thing as individual consciousness at all. That may well be the case, in which case someone like Gurdjieff would be right in that specific respect.
I agree with what you're saying, and it's something I've been long interested in, is in trying to identify the you're looking at the culture of these various extraterrestrial groups. In terms of the pissing on the floor, I heard that too, and it's an exact account. Strieber, in 12 years with the Gurdjieff Foundation, I am sure would have come to know Gurdjieff inside and out. And one of the things Gurdjieff said, he remarked to, I honestly can't remember him, but he said, in reference to some people who approached him and treated him as some kind of demigod, he said, these people, they don't think I use the toilet. And it's, I can sort of, and when you told that story, it made me think of that. There's sort of an overlay there. In terms of the actual a function of consciousness, this is any number of spiritual teachers make this very point. Gurdjieff, any number of Buddhists, Hindus, neo-non-dualist thinkers, they say, that the thinking and feeling associated with the ego is a state of sleep, is a degraded state. It's completely ineffective, or it's limp and it's flaccid and it's a poor and pale imitation of what's possible for a human being. So the thing with the visitors, you do have this, is that they have managed to transcend a lot of individuality. They don't have the same ego development. They don't have this. They don't seem to have that sort of rough-hewn sense of self that we have. You notice something, and then when you see them in groups, there's a uniform quality about them. Also, they don't seem to be particularly democratic. There often seem to be almost like militarily organized. There's a leader, there's someone in charge. You also see very little personal ostentation. So you see crews. It's not as if there's a guy wearing a watch or someone's got a bit of jewelry. Their hair is cut the same when these human-like beings. And that, to me, is overall smacks of some sort of, it's military-like, but it's also monastic-like. Earlier on, we were speaking about highly enlightened beings. It's within their nature that the people do reach the heights. They blend into anonymity. It's not that the egos become particularly sharpened and refined. And in terms of how they identify their own capacities, what they do say, because those say is that it doesn't come from me. Their own thinking, their thoughts, the arising, the insight that they have, which tends to be much more spontaneous and deeper. They'll say it's not from me. It's not coming out of a personality. It's just sort of the broader massive consciousness that exists, and it manifests in this locality, which you see sitting in front of you.
Well, if you look at the developmental dimension of human being, and then you look at what it is, to have a teenage child. The teenage child is, the reason why teenagers are so difficult is because they are in a phase where they are developing these ego objects that they passionately will defend because they feel that they're under threat. When you have the small child, on the one hand, you have this growing feeling of physical mastery, which is what accounts for the wonders of childhood. The fact that senses are all new, your body is working perfectly because you're so young and you're experiencing everything as new and vivid. And the older you grow in the body, the more things you can do physically, which creates this wonderful feeling of mastery and jubilation. But on account of the social, where you're being yelled at or accused or asked questions when your mind is not really in the mode of accounting for its own actions constantly, there's a kind of violence that's inflicted on the child on account of there being a social sphere. And they increasingly experience the alienation. They also increasingly experience their subjugation to the will of their parents, and they experience all that as an alienation. So when they enter into the teenage years, they develop these compensations. They like this thing, they like that thing, they're this type of person, they wear this type of hairdo, they identify with that type of group. And the silly arbitrariness of it, when you've got a kid who one year is punk and then the next year is an Islamist or whatever, it doesn't make any difference. That's how you know that all of these things are arbitrary ego trions. But later in life, I think that continues. The pace slows down and you finally settle on your preferred objects, your notion of who you are and what kind of thoughts that you think and how those thoughts feel. But essentially, it's all the same thing. Now, when you're talking about the organization of these aliens, I think you're absolutely right. Whether it's the grays or the blondes or any of them, they always seem divided by function. Now, if you think about it, wouldn't that be the way you'd do it if you had a choice? If you're going to organize the social in any way, you're going to organize it efficiently according to function. Now, why don't human beings do that? Well, in general, because they have egos. Exactly this sort of thing. If I have to conform to some sort of alien, for lack of a better term, organizational structure, that I experience as a threat to my preferred ego objects, my history of self-satisfaction. So I'm not going to do that, right? And of course, what is it to enter into the military as a human being? Well, it's a destruction of an ego. They say it explicitly. You go into the Marines. Well, we break you down and build you back up again. What is it when you join a cult? It's the same thing. What is that really? It's the destruction of ego objects and replacing them with other sets of preferred identifications. That in itself ought to tell you something, that there is something maybe not optimal about the explanations given by these spiritual traditions. Because if destroying the ego were itself enough, well, then we ought to venerate the U.S. Marines. We ought to venerate the Raelian cult. That's destruction of the ego.
No. I disagree with you point blank there. something like the US Marine Corps is not aiming at the destruction of the ego. It's talking about rebuilding the ego, reshaping the ego. So you develop a sense of pride because now you have an identification with an organization that is structured to, assaulting brown people in their country of residence. I mean, it's not the destruction of the ego. There's no effort here.
Well, look at it as it happens though across time. Why would someone decide to identify with these ego images of being a Marine and killing brown people? Well, that's because they're now in a state of absolute precariousness. Their own ego objects have been destroyed and they need ego objects. So then they go from nothing to something, whatever that something is. When your ego is destroyed first, you are at a moment of maximum danger, terrible fright and fearfulness, because that is who you are, right? And if you don't have those things, you're now nothing. Well, instantly they make the decision to go for the new something, whether it's the cult or the Marines and so on and so forth. So in those environments, now I'm not saying that that is what Buddhism is, that Buddhism involves the same destruction of the ego and the same recreation. What I'm saying, though, is if as a point of doctrine, you sort of overgeneralize and say, well, we need to destroy the ego. Well, there are plenty of cases where that happens. Cults, the military, and are those things necessarily what we would value? Well, no, not necessarily.
Well, I mean, no one in Buddhism says, yeah, you need to destroy the ego. It's not so structured. It's just simply a question of if you think that consider the ego objects as clouds which obscure the sun, what you simply allow is the sun by its energy, its heat, to encourage the clouds to dissipate. Think of it that way. There's no one screaming at you to, you're now a cog in a big Buddhist machine, and there's no you. It's not the same. I mean, no, there's an obvious difference there, but we still, to get back to the original point, is that when you're looking at these alien cultures, how they present themselves, how they manifest, is there's a certain, in their functioning, there's a certain mass quality. There's a lack of, an individuality there. I mean, Strieber once scorned the Greer's idea of a galactic federation by reasoning that if in our world, if we all of a sudden, there was a breakthrough in developing, say, superluminal technology, then at once, he said, out into the universe from this one planet, you'd have representatives of Goodall and Hezbollah and the Chinese Communist Party and the Argentinian government, and that would be what you would see out there. And he says, by the same token, he said, you would see the same coming here to Earth. He says, when we look at these, what we call aliens, he says, there is enormous diversity there. But the counterpoint of that is that there simply isn't enormous diversity there, because they are uniform, seemingly, in a determination not to force the hand of disclosure by not simply hovering above whatever stadium is hosting the Super Bowl. That doesn't happen. There's no forcing of the issue, which is to say that there must be some unity in purpose, which by definition points to a sort of a unity in self-understanding and or at least ethical unity of some kind. And for me, I would see that these beings from other worlds exhibit all the characteristics of the higher levels of consciousness as displayed by exemplars of the various traditions and as described by those traditions themselves. What I find especially interesting is the fact that these cultures, and in particular when I think of these human-like cultures or human-like aliens, my sense of it is that to reach that stage where a lot of them have seemingly transcended the ego and reach those very high levels of development, that must mean that in their history and their worlds, they've gone through extraordinarily extraordinary historical developments. They brought them to the point where they had a unified single world culture. That's interesting. Whereas in our world, that hasn't happened at all, which then points to a curious aspect in our consideration of their interaction with us. They may think that what we consider are enormously tragic and negative developments as necessary to our evolution. For instance, they may actually think it necessary for a Hitler to actually win out in the world, that somebody actually unifies the planet in the first instance and does for competing cultural forms. So at least then there's this foundation of unity, and from that there's change. Or alternatively, they may think it necessary, as with the individual, to go through enormous crises, enormous destruction in order to reach these higher levels of consciousness. And again, that is something the traditions say, is that once a human being commits himself to the path, then what happens is that the self, with a capital S, the consciousness itself, is prepared to throw you off the cliff to bring you to the point of self-realization. The tragedy and destruction and immense suffering is the inevitable result of that commitment. As such, then, their position in our world may not be what the likes of the Disclosure Project promote, that they're just waiting there to sort of help us into some sort of big, multicultural, namby-pamby, kumbaya, all 7 billion of us, Nelson Mandela wet dream sort of thing. That might not be their role. They might actually simply be sitting there waiting for a much more distant point in time. But we've gone through an enormous amount of tragedy, which collectively does for our ego. And then we're at a certain point where widely there's a sort of spiritual development that's not very isolated and unique. And that brings us to a point where we can actually begin to relate to them from a sure and sound footing, not from this sort of egoistic reaching. You see what the likes of Richard Dolan, they say, well, what can we offer them? Well, we're all individuals, I saw this. Richard Dolan is an intelligent man, but he did this thought experiment where he imagined himself engaging with an extraterrestrial of no particular description, and the extraterrestrials basically interrogating the humans, saying, well, you're out of your fucking minds. You're barbarians. You kill each other. You can't do anything. You're hopeless. You're lost. And he comes back with he says, well, we are individuals, and I think he quotes some American revolutionary. And it's just it sounded like a glorified presidential election stump speech. It's appalling. But
it's always the same dogma, this individuality thing, because if you see the ego as an object and not as some self-evident subject that's thinking, then the whole situation changes. But what you say there, I think, is quite excellent. There are 3 points that I would make, backtracking considerably. First off, I can say that I have seen and read or heard 1,000 times that the ego is an obstacle. When you offer an interpretation that involves, the clouds and the sun and so on, I think that may be the correct interpretation, or it may simply be a sophisticated, nuanced one. But certainly in the popularized spirituality that's out there today, whether it's the New Age form of Buddhism, and not just Buddhism, but the others, the idea is that the ego is an obstacle, that the only thing separating us from this mystical, ecstatic union with everything in the universe is the ego. And if we could simply overcome the obstacle of the ego, then we would experience it directly. So that's point number 1. So there are people who say that. Point number 2, regarding the Strieber scenario of, a complex mix of social forms and so on. In what we've been discussing, you have a perfectly viable refutation of that scenario. Because, you think of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton started her political life as a Goldwater Republican. So she's basically an authoritarian conservative. And yet in the 90s now, she's pushing quasi-socialist healthcare reform. And today, among the great unwashed, she's regarded as a quote-unquote liberal. Now, of course, there are new interpretations of that would point out that she's basically an imperialist like all the rest. But put that aside. The point is that someone like Hillary Clinton can go from being a Goldwater Republican to what is programmatically asserted to be its opposite. And this is constant in politics. In fact, this is politics par excellence. You encounter these idiots, especially coming out of university, who are one political faction, then a totally different one. Oh, well, first I was a fascist, and then I became Trotskyite, and then I discovered that I was more into Mao, and then eventually it was, they go from one identification to another, just showing how pointlessly arbitrary it is. It's an entire identification and nothing besides. Now, if you look at the Strieber scenario and all of these different groups, quote unquote, to outsiders like so-called aliens, they may not be different at all. If you actually understand the mechanism underlying all of these manifestations, you would say that there's nothing of interest there at all. And here's another point of agreement with Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff stresses, at least in Ouspensky, again and again and again, the mechanism involved, the mechanical quality of the ego, the fact that it's all simply mechanical, that it's all cause and effect, and that what seems to be independent of cause and effect is not at all, once you see the mechanism. Now, when you look at all of these ego identifications, I am such and such, I belong to this group, I belong to that group, I'm a Catholic, I'm a neoconservative, I'm whatever. When you understand the underlying mechanism and how purely mechanical it is, they're all irrelevant. They're just irrelevant manifestations of the same absurdity. So our so-called individuality is a joke. It's another story we tell ourselves. So there's that. From their point of view, none of these are at all interesting. And likewise, if they've overcome that kind of need to identify with an ego object in order to provide compensation for their isolation on account of the fact that they're actually now all telepathically connected in a much more vivid way, well then, it's obvious what they think about it. They don't have anything like it. They divide their society, if you want to call it that, into social functions. And they don't have the cultural in the same way we do. So even if you take Strieber's Gurdjieffian aliens to be dubious and his emphasis on the triad, that at least is a scenario that speaks of pure function. If you have three grays, a positive, a negative, and a reconciling, right? Even if the scenario is false when compared to reality, he at least is presenting a picture where their relations are defined by pure function. That's point number two. The third and final point is what you're talking about calamity, what you were saying about calamity. I think, and I fully concur with what you're saying, I see the only route to transformation, spiritual improvement, and the development of consciousness and so on, basically being brought to the absolute point of death. And here again, you have an interesting reference in Strieber, because if you read the short story Pain and so on, he may be the only writer I can think of who has so clearly visualized and articulated that point of intersection between life and death. Now, it's important to stress that this is nevertheless death as conceived from the point of view of life. And I think that when you are really brought to the point of annihilation, like in an abduction experience, life in you, the fact that you are in life form, that life bubbles up in such a desperate effort to overcome this impending death, that what you experience is life in its most vivid, active form, and that's, of course, the sexual. So the whole fact that you have this idea that dying is erotic is, in a sense, a misconstrual. What happens is when life and death are brought head to head close together, in order for life to sustain itself in the face of death, it brings its most lifelike aspect to bear, namely the sexual. Not only in terms of sensation is the sexual the most vivid thing you'll encounter in life, but the sexual itself is about procreation, reproducing life. That's probably no coincidence. So that's how I regard that. And I think that probably some sort of experience of high intensity of that sort will be what ends up happening to human beings. You've got to reduce the population down to almost nothing, maybe even one individual. Now, how you survive biologically after that, I don't know. But you have to have this basic collective death of humanity experienced in the most prolonged fashion possible and absorbed before you can come back from that. And as problematic a document as the key is, there is a lot of basis for this particular notion in it. The whole idea of returning to the forest and, mankind either ascending or going extinct. The fact that it's presented as an alternative may hint at the other fact that, in a way, they're intimately related. And this is discussed throughout that so-called discussion. So, you have to experience death in life. And that's exactly what you were saying. I mean, in order to evolve, you have to be again and again brought to the point of destruction, basically. And that makes a certain sense when you consider that we are biological life forms and our lives have lives of their own. And the spiritual, in a way, is something counter to or contrary to the biological. It's automatism. So you've got to reduce that life aspect. You've got to beat it back to the point of almost being snuffed out in order for something else to step in and contribute.
Well, if there was one book which had a defining influence on my life, it was a book called Zelator by David Ovenson that I read 10 years ago in 2005. And it was, I found this book in one of the most bizarre shops I've ever been in. And it was in a place called Albany here in Western Australia. And Albany is quite remote. It's a very remote town of some 30,000. And this store is still there, I believe, a secondhand goods store of all varieties. They had extraordinary amount of stuff in there. It was basically a warehouse, a huge warehouse filled with all sorts of artifacts and objects. They had books. They had a large book section, but they'd been accumulating this since the foundation of Australia 114 years ago. So it was filled with stuff that was so dated, like prospects for detente in the 1980s. This sort of stuff. A collection of books by Soviet dissidents, a collection of essays by Soviet dissidents. This sort of thing, filled with this sort of stuff. Really old, moldy books. And then I found on a shelf, midway down at exactly eye level, this pristine copy of this book, Zelator by David Ovenson, which in itself is an extraordinary repository of lore about the Western esoteric tradition, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and the like. And interestingly, it's the only place I've ever been able to find reference for the radiant body. That exact, yeah. He in that book, he links it to a Greek term that I've never been able to find reference elsewhere, which is strange. So in that book, at least, there was something I read and it stayed with me, is that Zelator is an account of the spiritual history of one man. And in it, it recounts an enormous personal disaster that this person experienced. And this basically involved a woman. He met a woman in a group, and she was beautiful, and she was interested in spiritual things, and they were married, and so on. And of course, he finds that she cheated on him, and she had an affair, and the rest. And this is a life-defining catastrophe for him. But he frames in the discussion, he said that he had asked a teacher of his who he revered, that this teacher quoted a British historian who said that everyone who engages in the path will have to face. And he gives a date, I can't recall, 1317, which was to him the most evil day in human history, was the destruction of the Templar Order by order of the French crown. And this is something that's borne out in the Eastern traditions too. They say that once human beings commit themselves to the evolution of their consciousness, they bring to themselves all karmic bills due. and they face extraordinary trials and suffering, immense suffering. And for what it's worth, I mean, in my experience, it's been borne out. I went through things, and I've said to people, if I knew this were to happen to me, I'd have hanged myself 10 years ago. But nonetheless, brought it about. Overall, though, as I say, you shall know the tree by its fruits. All that destruction and suffering was to the good, because it shatters particular ego attachments, primarily by showing the dualistic nature of such attachments. And it gives you a genuine release from the animal world, from the animal kingdom, and its dualistic nature.
Well, there's a lot to that. I can certainly sympathize with that. Now, I, for reasons of my own, really stay away from meditation and spiritual development. As ridiculous as that sounds, I try to avoid it as much as I possibly can. But I have had a suspicion that if there is any kind of decision making that goes on outside of life, that I may have decided to endure ridiculous things in this life. Or, to bring it more closely to what you just said, if a decision was made in childhood, for example, toward this sort of thing, the spiritual, the more clear, and so on, that decision brought on this kind of hardship. I can say with honesty that certainly my adult life has been one long procession of attacks and mobbing. I've been relentlessly persecuted. Now, that's not a way to, say I'm some sort of victim. What I'm saying is that there are simply an improbable number of events of being mobbed and persecuted. Now, I bring a great deal personally to bear. In fact, I think in many cases, unconsciously, I artfully bring this about. But I can say it was just 2 weeks ago, I was attacked at the bar here, ended up in an ambulance, and then brought home bed bugs from the fucking ambulance. In fact, practically every bar I've ever gone to, I've either been thrown out or physically attacked. It wasn't that long ago that I was attacked by a bar owner. And you see, what I actually do to produce these events is almost unidentifiable. I mean, I don't go in there and start pissing on the floor, and I don't run up and beat somebody over the head with a chair. I, in fact, strictly speaking, do nothing. But I can draw this kind of reaction again and again and again. I was in a bar one time where I had a little kid come up and slap me across the face repeatedly. Now, I've been chased out of universities. I've been accused of being a potential serial killer, a potential mass shooter, a terrorist. I've been fired from jobs at the workplace because I was considered an imminent danger to others. And yet, I've never lifted a hand against anyone. And if I'm attacked in a fight, I'm more likely to just stand there and watch. Now, if it's somebody else who's attacked, I'd like to think I'll jump in and defend them. But if it's just me, I won't do anything. I'll just stand there and watch what's happening. But this long parade of horribles, I mean, part of me suffers from it, but another part of me is perfectly delighted and satisfied with it. Now, I go back to my childhood, and I have memories of being delighted and enamored with the idea of having bad luck, being cursed. I mean, I would run underneath a ladder like 20 times after hearing that, each time you go under a ladder, you get 7 years bad luck. I'd do it with thrills, Now, how stupid was that? The same thing with opening an umbrella in the house. Any superstition that supposedly led to bad luck, I would go straight to it and do it. Now, what kind of weird decision-making in the mind of the child was involved there? Maybe what you're saying. Maybe if you decide to go toward what we're calling the spiritual, which is an interest more in the way things are rather than the day-to-day animal existence of food to mouth and so on, that somehow it has to go that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I've noticed this too in the process of my own life, that I've thought at times I would sell my soul to the devil for a quiet, bland, anonymous middle-class existence. But I just can't get it off the ground. I just cannot get it to work. But, from another perspective, the more I stick with things, I can see the purpose in it. I can see the meaning behind it. And obviously, from that I extrapolate out into trying to understand, the collective destruction to come. And I was just reading today, Greer, he writes, he speaks about like some visions he had where there has been some enormous earth changes, and he sees a vast fleet of UFOs in the skies present in the world, helping the survivors. He doesn't give numbers, but he says we are greatly diminished. Now the obvious question is, well, why didn't this great fleet step in to prevent this great diminishment? There's obviously this sort of, it seems that my reading is that the way they view things is that some things are absolutely necessary in a way to break us down. Like in one way, we would never develop a planetary civilization unless every single civilization here goes through an overwhelmingly powerful set of shared experience. Is that everyone in the Middle East, everyone in Europe, everyone in America, everyone in Africa goes through the same set of experiences. They're so powerful, so defining, so changing, that they unify us and give us a whole set of shared narratives that then we become, one people, albeit one people scratching around in the rubble. And that's the way I see things going forward. I believe that there will be these things which will just blow to smithereens our acquired ego, our acquired collective ego objects, the pride in the Ummah, the pride in Israel, or in a European race, whatever. I think that will just be overwhelmed and destroyed by what is to come. And then from that, I think then it's interesting, is in Greer's story, that's when there's a mass presence of extraterrestrials. It's almost as, okay, now we can help you. Now we can work.
Well, this is all actually quite interesting because it connects directly to everything that we've been discussing so far. In other words, it becomes possible to kind of imagine a reason for the failure of disclosure.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean the failure of these extraterrestrials to announce themselves. Let's suppose that the social and the political are what we've discussed. And let's suppose that unbeknownst to ourselves, and unlike these explanations we create in order to account for ourselves, the fact is that human beings are isolated, deficient, and all of human culture and the social and the political is dominated by basically a war of all against all, owing to our fundamental deprivation. Now, I believe that here and there are instances of shared consciousness. And I think, unlikely enough, that there's a relationship between what we call love and shared consciousness. I think here and there at the edges, in all sorts of unnameable places and on forgotten occasions, human beings have shared consciousness. And I further think that consciousness only exists when it's shared. In that sense, the only consciousness is transconsciousness. Now, human beings, as they're physically constituted at the moment, don't really exhibit any kind of transconsciousness or shared consciousness, except here and there at the edges in very rare cases. It may very well be that the evolutionary change that's required in order for us to evolve, quote unquote, into something better, may be a step in the direction of what they seem to have, which is this ongoing shared consciousness with one another. It may very well be that, on the one hand, they're trying to bring us to that point, but on the other hand, they do not want their presence to become known to the human social and cultural and political sphere, precisely because then, in a way, it'll have been wasted. They'll have shot their wad early. If they become a reality to us, while before we reach the state of shared consciousness, then they will become something to the human collective, which is a kind of misfire. In other words, what I'm speculating about is that, there is a self-perpetuating reality to the human collective. Just like we were talking about at the beginning, there is a kind of distinct sphere of the human collective. That's not to say that it's shared consciousness. That's not to say that there's a collective unconscious, another concept that irritates me, but that there is a collective social domain which is independent in a certain way, different from the individual. And things have a reality in the collective sphere, the social, that is different than what they might have for the individual, in a sense. Now, if something becomes real in the collective social sense, opportunities for it to have an impact may be wasted elsewhere. That is, if the reality of extraterrestrials becomes evident to human beings before we have reached that stage where we are sharing minds, then the way we process and comprehend and create that encounter will have been wasted, because we used a primitive mind to reach it and to construct it and so on before we had the fundamentals in place. And the fundamentals may be this ability to share minds to a much greater extent than we currently have. And again, following what we've been talking about, it may well be that in order to bring about that physical change, which is an evolutionary species-wide change, human beings basically have to be brought to the point of death for the adaptation to occur.
Yeah. It's interesting too, going back to, as you said that, what Gurdjieff, he says that invariably what can happen with the human being is that they can crystallize on the wrong basis, is that their personality is such that it prevents the receipt of impressions which can fuel the development of the essence. In effect, you die while still alive. And at that point, you are circling the drain and you don't even know it. And you're just going round and around. The patterns repeat, but there's no growth, there's no possibility of growth, there's no possibility of awakening. He says in that instance, the only thing that can break up the personality is immense suffering. Is immense suffering, that the patterns are broken down by exposing the duality of all these attachments to the self, to awareness itself. And here in this world, I mean, you could say we're fairly crystallized. The other night I had a bottle of wine one night, and I found the American Conservative magazine. I'm not sure if you know it, but
I know of it.
Yeah, and it seems. I mean, it seemed it's nostalgic. Maybe fundamentally, it's nostalgic for a world gone. And I read for its articles on Europe, discussing France, Germany, the demographic change and the like. And it seems that saving world-changing events, Europe will largely be Muslim within 100 years, easily. And in that instance, in time, the Islamic law will impose itself on the cultures, and Europe will be oriented towards Mecca. And in thinking of this, I did consider how would how the aliens respond to this? Surely their interactions with us have this in mind. They will be dealing with it like we're in Muslim Europe or an increasingly third world US. And in a way, I had to think, well, if Europe becomes Islamic, if France becomes Islamic, well, then is it worth dealing with at all? Now, of course, that's just a sort of a primitive instance of what we spoke about earlier on. I mean, but I can see from that perspective again why you would almost wish for world-changing catastrophe to prevent certain outcomes as that you would really hope for a complete breakdown in the current crystallization. And then that means that who they are for us is something much different than is being considered by anybody, even someone like Greer, who doesn't seem to be able to put together what he has said himself.
it would be false to trivialize in some sort of pedantic way the truly heartfelt experience that a human being frequently has of himself and of his world by insisting that, oh no, it's just a mechanism. In other words, when someone is lamenting, oh tempora, oh more, you know, or people are experiencing the destruction of their world, you know, only a complete idiot would miss the important dimensions of that in terms of feeling, and only a complete idiot would fail to have compassion toward it, even though it may still ultimately just be an expression of a particular kind of mechanism. Now, whether the aliens have any kind of care for the intrinsic worth of our institutions and our nation states and so on, I supremely doubt. I suspect that just like an artist with his palette, if you're trying to mix a particular color paint, a particular shade of a color, and you've got 3 or 4 or 5 separate globs of primary colors, you start mixing them together, what you're doing is destroying the individual paints. You're destroying their separate identity, the basic identity, in pursuit of something different. And no one gives a moment's thought to that. Likewise, if you're trying to engineer human history and human development, you might be mixing populations. Worlds have been destroyed before. The Roman Empire, the various Greek empires, which nobody wants to admit existed. The human world has been destroyed countless times, overturned, and recreated. And this is perhaps an expression of what we were talking about, you know, the experience of death and life. It's the same type of thing. I can say on that point that, personally speaking, it's the same thing. Whatever past intelligence I might have had, and whatever thought that I've given to myself as being capable through thought of arriving at different states of being and so on, really the decisive factor has always been suffering for me. And the problem with that is that at that moment of maximum suffering, you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. You don't see how, oh, this is going to lead to my transformation. You don't, because then it wouldn't be maximum suffering. What happens is you're in that long, dark night of the soul, maximum helplessness, and then somehow you're not anymore. Somehow, because of the passage of time, you're not in it, and you find that a transformation has occurred that perhaps only becomes more and more visible over time, subsequent to the experience, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So it's only through these moments of profound suffering is there a transformation that goes beyond the ego making cosmetic changes to itself.
And that's why, you know, I don't mean to exaggerate the significance of meditation. It's not the be all and end all, and many spiritual teachers have said this. It's not that, you know, take one human being, add meditation, boom, you got enlightenment. It just doesn't work like that. There have been people who've heard a teaching once and they become enlightened because they were, as I say, they were ripened. There have been other enlightened teachers who said the self, Papaji, for example, the self picks people to be enlightened for reasons best known to them, to itself. It just happens. So there's nothing mechanical about that. It's not some formula you discover and apply. Which is to speak to the point of just the value of life itself, of ordinary living. You know, it's not spirituality, some special dispensation for the lucky few. It's again all part of consciousness as an experience itself, and a matter of fundamentally releasing patterns of attachment. And suffering does that. I've known that. I would have to say, for whatever meditation I've undergone, the real changes have occurred as a result of suffering. I said it earlier on, I'll say it again. There have been times, if I'd known what I've gone through, I would have hanged myself as a refusal, as a protest to undergo this, to undergo what I went. But I have to stand right now and say, yeah, I'm grateful for it. I can see there was value in it. And its value even lies as a teacher. Like, one thing I understand right now is that if my life has any direction and purpose at this point in time, it is to give itself over as wholeheartedly to the spiritual process. And of course, once you do that, then you meet the resistance, and the resistance often in the form of a woman. You know, you meet a woman, she draws you in. And it was just recently, the same thing happened again. I met a woman, I have the same set of emotions and feelings, you know, that deep sinking feeling that says no, 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 no. But I've been, yeah, really. There's nothing, it's not all common on her. Lovely, very capable, attractive human being. No, it's not her at all. But I understand that it's not for me. And I've been here before, and I forced my way past those feelings, all my doubts and regrets, and I went forward. And of course, what happens? It doesn't work out. You know, there's a certain experience, certain lessons that went through that. But right now, I mean, I'm facing the same thing. But the difference being, I've gone through so much that I've learned. Maybe I've learned a lot more, and are less likely to fall into that Mayan trap, the trap of what this world and its can present to you. And I think for humanity as a whole, there will be that experience, particularly in the realm of consumerism. As the master of the key said, he said, given what you're about to go through, you will never be again so materialistic. I can't remember the exact quote, but there is that term. It says, given what is
Sure.
what is to happen to you. And there'll be those changes there. And the other part I should add is that it's noted that the more there tends to be sort of crude counter argument against spiritual discipline and application, and that the other things that need to be looked after, your career and all the rest, and blah blah blah. And as has been noted, as you commit yourself to spiritual development, whatever form, all that other stuff looks after itself. That the ego, that part of you that talks about things and feels about things and seeks to control things, which you attribute the successes and ease of your living to, as that diminishes, you still experience more successes, and your life becomes easier without any effort to control it from a sense of individual agency. And that may be what as a whole we are about to experience, particularly in Western civilization, or the developed world, with its tendencies towards technological and economic development, which is to say, with its tendencies towards gathering and applying power. As that is broken down and gives way, we may discover something else. We may discover, I think, what it is to live by grace, which is to rest in the collective power. But we'll see.
I think I know exactly what you mean. When you want a particular thing or a particular experience, a particular kind of life, and you try it, and you completely want it, but again and again you return to it and discover that there are things inside of you that make it impossible. So though you want it, it's not for you, which is a kind of impossible contradiction that I think many people never experience, or if they experience it, they're never conscious of it, or they dumbly continue to try to make it work when it can't. Getting all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, talking about the beautiful woman on the subway. I think love invites that kind of problem, because love I think of as being the engagement in full of the person with another. And there have been experiences in my life where I've, through again a kind of perverse accident, encountered some women who are undeniably beautiful in that uncommon way, and there's the potential for love, for a relationship. And in every case, how, like, if take the more overt parallel, you go to meet the family of someone you're in a relationship with, for the first time. And, you see that crazy uncle. Everybody's got the crazy uncle in their family. So maybe you go meet the girl's family and she's really embarrassed because she's got this crazy uncle. So now you see the real nitty gritty, of the family. Well, imagine if you're a person and inside your household, the household of your mind, you've got like 1,000 crazy uncles. And yet, so, on one hand, you have a notion of what love is and what it should be and what kind of person you should be with that will support that kind of love. And, and then by freak accident, you encounter these women that are absolutely beautiful and developed spiritually and pristine, in all sorts of respects. But then, oh no, if there's the possibility or the chance for love, the baying hordes are going to come out and sabotage the entire thing. Now, that's happened to me more than once. So now, as awful as it is, I've gotten to the point where I now understand love is not for me.
Mm.
I mean, that's horrible when your whole life, is spent around the truth and so on, and this relationship, obviously, to love and all of these things that you value, and yet you are incompatible with it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not even sure if I'm responding to your point. What immediately comes to mind is I just finished reading a biography of Albert Speer and Gita Sarani, and one thing with her, in her own sort of unfocused and unstructured way, she delivers enormous insight into the human condition, and particularly about Speer. And she says that she speaks of him in his problems fundamentally. The book's subtitle is His Battle with Truth. Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth. And Speer is, I'm sure you know, he was Hitler's favorite, one of his favorites. He was a young architect. He designed the Nuremberg rallies. He drew up the plans for Germania, the great city to replace Berlin that was never built. And he later was Hitler's minister for armaments production, which is to say he was one of the most powerful men in the Reich. Singularly amongst that sharp end of the Nazi hierarchy, he avoided execution at Nuremberg, basically because he was able to convince them that he had no knowledge of the great atrocities being perpetrated. Now, in an almost lunatic irony, his subordinate, Sokol, got executed for some of the activities which came under Speer's purview. But Speer, as I said, he managed to convince the court he knew nothing. Sereni came to, through a close relationship with Speer and through analysis, came to the view, and through long engagement, basically convinced Speer, and Speer came to admit that that wasn't true. He knew what was happening to the Jews. And towards the end of the life, he admitted something, which Sereni pointed out, that if he had said that in the courtroom in Nuremberg in 1946, he'd have found himself on the end of a rope. But she talks about he had a strange development towards the end of his life. He would have been mid-70s. And he had the happy fortune to begin a relationship with an attractive woman in her late 30s. And she made the point that, I thought it was an acute one, that he'd succeeded in developing a mental romantic connection with his wife, with the woman. But in his life, until that point, he'd never succeeded in developing that physical sexual relationship, the physical sexual fulfillment. And she said, as such, he was an incomplete man. And, that term really impacted me, because I would ask the same thing of myself. That am I incomplete for failing in that regard, for having that, grand relationship that I think I see other people having? I've had relationships that have been unfulfilling or catastrophic or whatever. But what I find is nonetheless juxtaposed against that sort of my desire for a normality I see around me is a desire or a determination to walk all the way away from that and drop it all and like give myself over 100% to the spiritual process. And right now, that's what every instinct I have tells me. And even to finally break, to hold to celibacy, knowing that it will finally resolve itself. And that in itself is, it's an especial agony, but it's of the piece with I'm unable to secure for myself that which I think I need and want, which, as I said, is nothing. I'm not actually looking for much out of life at all. And it's been a source of enormous frustration to me. I see every sort of fucking idiot around me can get, well, I want a big house, I want a boat, I want a big TV, I want this, I want that, and the other. And like, these fucking people pull it off. I think I'm every bit as able as these people. And I'm asking for nothing, but I can't get it. And it just, again speaks to the wisdom of the tradition, saying is that, you have a higher self. There's a part of you that sees things in the bardo and you structure things to impose certain changes upon yourself. And it's all directed in a way you just can't see and feel at the time, because there are experiences necessary for what you seek to acquire over the longest haul.